Hello, we are back with Chapter 11 of Bound for All. So, in Chapter 10, we discovered that Mr. Grant had gone off to go hunting, but in the situation had lost his horse, and because of the high temperatures and the lack of water, he was starting to suffer from dehydration, which caused him to become very swollen, very weak. Thankfully, Mary Ellen's father and Mr. Grant's son found him in time. They were able to take care of him, and after a couple days, were able to get him back on his feet and doing things and moving forward again with their trip. So here we are with Chapter 11 as they are approaching the Rocky Mountains. For some time now, we had been crossing the Rocky Mountains, but most of the time the inclines had been gradual that we hardly realized it. From the very beginning of our journey, Father told us we actually had been climbing across the vast prairies, up hills, and down, up once more again. Now we could see tall rocky peaks in the distance, scraping up against the clouds. In the middle of July, 2 weeks later than Father had hoped, when we passed Fort Laramie. I was disappointed that we didn't even get to catch a glimpse of the fort. Once it had been a trading post of the Hudson Bay Company, but now the main road passed it by, and soon after that we left the Platte River at last. We had followed it for over 400 miles, Father said. It seemed to me like much more. Now we had to cross 50 miles of desert, covered only by sagebrush and a few dried-up salt-crusted ponds, to reach the banks of the Sweetheart River. On the first day we made 22 miles, starting early in the morning and traveling late into the evening, until we reached a place called Willow Springs. In all that time we did not pass a single stream. We weren't thirsty, since we carried kegs of water with us, but our animals suffered. John and I gave Polly and Rover a small drink each, and Mr. Grant remembered his terrible experience in the wilderness, felt so sorry for his animals that he tried to give every one of them a little water, but the small amount only seemed to increase their thirst. Another long day's journey brought us to the Sweet Water, a cool, clear, fast-running stream with flowers dotting its banks, and the day after that we passed through the Devil's Gate. Here the river had worn its way through a tiny gap between the mountains that stood 400 feet high. To me it looked as if some giant's hand had sawn apart those mountains just far enough for a stream to wind through. Now we were really in the Rockies. I could understand how they had gotten their name. Tall spires of rock towered up on every side, with very little growing on them, except in places where dirt and sand had been blown into small crevices. Here and there I saw white gleams of snow. A little farther on, Father said we would come to South Pass, where the waters divided. It is called the Continental Divide, he explained. Every drop of water in one stream will flow toward the Atlantic Ocean, and in the next, every drop of water will flow to the Pacific. Standing next to him in the chilly morning air, looking at a ragged patch of snow up in the mountainside, I felt myself shiver. All of these mountains still to cross, I thought, and snow coming before too long. It came early in the mountains. I knew from all the stories we had heard. Pulling Mother's shawl close around me, I hurried to gather wood for a bonfire. But a few days later, just beyond South Pass, we found ourselves crossing another desert. This one looks to be about 40 miles wide, Father told us, after carefully studying his guidebook, and no water can be found until we reach the Green River on the other side. Although Mr. Grant's strength was quickly returning, his ordeal seemed to have made him more cautious. It would not be wise to try to cross in the heat of the day, he warned. So we filled up every bucket and keg and cooking pot and any other vessel that could hold water, and at 4 o'clock that afternoon, we started out. In this late in the day, the sun felt fiery hot, and within an hour the tongues were all panting and their long pink tongues lolling out. We stopped to give them a short rest and to eat our cold supper of dried meat and bread. Picking up a bucket of water, John went to each of the oxen, washing the dust off their noses and letting them wet their tongues. All that night, under a pale sliver of moon, the wagons rumbled along, bumping over the sagebush and gravel beds and slogging through sand. Father and Mr. Grant walked alongside, cracking their whips and calling out to the oxen. "Get up, Ben! Gee a little there, Jerry!" Lavinia and Cynthia slept through all the noise, but I kept waking up. The shouts and pops of the whips rang in my ears, and that clatter of the wheels that never stopped. No longer did they seem to be saying, "Going to Oregon, going to Oregon." Instead, they just whispered softly, "Chuggity-chug, chuggity-chug, chuggity-chug." Sometimes I felt as if all I'd ever done was ride in this wagon. All those wheels were going on to keep turning forever. At last, about noon on the following day, we came out of the desert into the cool shade of the Green River. The last few miles were down a steep, rocky slope. The oxen were so glad to see the water that Father could barely stop them from running right into the river. I felt almost the same. I dipped my hands into the clear, icy water, splashed them on my face, and let it run through my fingers until they tingled with the delicious cold. Look over there, Mother said, bending down next to me. Growing close to the water were clumps of sour dock and other weeds. Oh, can we pick some? I asked. For weeks now, I've been pining for green vegetables and fruits. We occasionally got fresh meat, making a change for our usual bread and bacon, and Blackie still gave a little milk. And almost every Sunday, we had a mess of dried fruit. But that was not the same. Yes, said Mother, with one of her rare smiles. She and I gathered them up and fixed greens for supper, and everyone ate them happily. All during our long trip through Wyoming, we kept encountering wagon trains in far worse condition than we were. Many oxen had given out by now, and cows had to be put in their places in the teams. Some wagons had also given out, forcing families to double up. Food supplies were growing dangerously low, and many people were sick and discouraged. Occasionally, some families still turned back. We're going back to God's country, one gaunt, sunken-eyed couple said to us, if these critters will only take us there. Father always stopped to help whenever he could. He assisted men in resetting tires and mending broken-down wagons. He and Mother insisted on sharing our food, even Blackie's small amount of milk, and he never seemed too tired to offer cheerful advice to families in distress. Thank you, Mr. Todd, they would say, eyes brimming with gratitude, and I felt a warm flush of pride at having such a father. We often met Indians along the way. Sometimes we traded them for buffalo meat, if it was fresh. Always they tried to tell us that they were peaceful toward the whites. Most recently had been the Crows, who would say right up to us, their faces brightly painted, and say, Go fight Sioux! Yet we also kept hearing about their stealing stock from other wagon trains, especially horses and young cattle. One morning John came back from tending the animals, and his face looked troubled. Pet is missing, he told Father. Maybe she has strayed a little, Father said. He went out searching for the horse, but he could not find her. I'm afraid she must have been taken by the Indians, Father told us when he returned. We had seen a few Indians in the distance the night before. Poor Pet, said Lavinia, her eyes slowly filling up with tears. The gray mare was nearly as tame as Daisy had been, and had learned to eat out of our hands. For the next 2 days, Lavinia kept looking over her shoulder, peering out the back of the wagon as if she expected to see Pet come galloping to catch up with us. But we never saw her again. On a morning afternoon, we were traveling along as usual. We had gone about 5 or 6 miles when Father sent John on ahead to look for a nooning place. Lavinia and I were walking at the back of the wagon. Up ahead, I could see John stopping at what appeared to be a small creek. Just past him, up on a ridge, was an Indian camp. As we came closer, I noticed that the Indians were packing up to leave, putting packs on ponies, strapping papooses on the women's backs. We had become so used to them by now that I didn't think anything about it. But suddenly, about 20 of those Indians, some of them on horseback, rushed toward John. They were shouting and shaking their buffalo robes at him, trying to stampede his horse. Polly reared up on her hind legs, and John cried out, and I saw them surround him. What is this? Father said sharply, urging the oxen forward. Moments later, Indian ponies blocked the path of our wagons. People and animals milled about in confusion. A young Indian on horseback came circling back, a rope in his hands, his long black hair and blanket streaming in the wind. And before I knew what was happening, he had thrown a lasso at me. I stared in stunned surprise as it struck the wagon cover above my head, then settled over me. I tried to throw it off, but I could feel the rope slipping down over my hands. The Indian was so close. His black eyes glittered. No! I cried under my breath. I struggled with rope. I had to get it off. I had to get away from that Indian. Then somehow I fought my way free. Lavinia and I scrambled desperately into our wagon. Quickly I buttoned down the cover. As I did, I caught a glimpse of another Indian cutting the rope that tied Blackie to the back of the wagon. It was so dark inside. I could see nothing, but I heard John screaming at the top of his lungs as he fought with the Indians. Other Indians were struggling with Father, probably trying to take away his gun. I thought I heard a grunt, a cry of pain, then a dull thud. Cynthia was sobbing in a low, ragged voice. More shouts and sounds of scuffling came from the Grant's wagon behind us. It was clear that we were surrounded and outnumbered. Yet for some reason the Indians hesitated to finish off the attack. Then I felt something poke at the wagon cover right beside me. An Indian was trying to lift it to see what was inside. But why? Did they want to see how many more were in our party? To make sure they were really outnumbered? Lavinia and I held on to each other, too frightened to speak. I could barely breathe. The wagon cover was jabbed again from the other side this time. Luckily, I had fastened it tight. Several more times this happened. The Indians seemed to have decided that they had nothing to fear from us. They were closing in. Their shouts grew louder, turning into war whoops. This was the end. At any moment now they would attack. I closed my eyes. My hands gripped Lavinia's tightly. Just then a shot was fired nearby. The Indians grew suddenly silent. I heard another shot. A moment later, hoofbeats pounded away, fading into the distance. "They're gone!" cried Mother. Her voice cracked, turning into a sob. I couldn't believe it. What had happened to drive them away? I crawled to the opening in the wagon cover. It was true. All of those Indians had disappeared, vanished like smoke. And then I understood why. To our rear, up on a small ridge, I could make out a party of 3 or 4 hunters. Behind them was a broad cloud of dust that could only be another wagon train. Lavinia and I laughed with relief. Mother was crying. John seemed to be half laughing and half crying as he told the story of how the Indians had forced him off his horse. Putting down his rifle, Father went to comfort Mother. As I took Cynthia out of Mother's arms, tears were streaming down her plump cheeks. "Don't yike them," she sobbed, clinging to my neck. We were relieved to find Blackie quietly grazing a short distance away. As soon as the hunters came riding up, one lean and gray-haired and weather-beaten, another big with an easy smile, and a boy about John's age. "We heard you shouting and saw the Indians," the older one said, his blue eyes bright against the leathery brown. "We figured something must be wrong, so we fired our guns." "Thank you," was all Father and Mother and the Grants could say, over and over again. When the rest of their long wagon train caught up with us, Father talked to its captain, a man named Joab Powell. He agreed to take us under his protection. We had not seen much in the large wagon train with so many people and vast herds of cattle and horses since our first days out of independence. That night all of the wagons were arranged in a circle. The tongue of one was attached to the rear of the wheels of the next, forming a kind of fence. Inside this tight, safe corral were all our animals, the horses securely picketing to stake out, and ourselves, and Captain Powell posted guards in shifts to keep watch for Indians all night long. "Will they come back?" asked Lavinia, when at last we were putting on our night clothes. Her eyes were big in the lamplight, and her fingers clutched at the neck of her nightgown. "I don't think so," Father reassured her. "It's not that those Indians were on the warpath with the whites. They saw a small party and thought they could overpower us and make off with our animals. But now we are a part of a large wagon train. I believe we are safe." I couldn't stop thinking about that young Indian who had thrown his lasso at me. If he had caught me, would he have dragged me away? I asked Father. Father was silent for a moment, and his voice was sober when he replied, "We can't know for certain what he would have done, but remember, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." Good night, Mary Ellen. Try to go to sleep now. I wrapped myself in Grandma's quilt, trying to put aside the troubled pictures of all jumbled inside my head, so I could sleep. Little by little, the evening sounds of camp grew quiet. Fires died out, and everyone but the guards went off to bed. I could hear a low, indistinct murmur of talk from the next wagon. A horse gave a muffled whinny. A touch of breeze rustled the wagon cover for a moment, then moved away. Somewhere far off, a wolf howled. At that, dogs began to bark, large dogs and little dogs, deep baying voices and shrill yapping ones, and Rover's familiar growl. If any Indians tried to sneak up on this camp, I thought sleepily, surely they would be frightened away. So another interesting interaction with the Native Americans again on this trail. And so we see they've joined a larger wagon train, which will make for a very different trip for them from here on out. Thank you for joining me.